New York City in the 1920s and 1930s was a place where contradictions danced together beneath the glow of neon. Its skyline crackled with ambition, steel towers clawing upward while the streets below pulsed with 1,000 hidden agendas. Jazz poured from basement clubs. Bootleg liquor flowed behind locked doors. Politicians shook hands in daylight and made promises in darkness. The city was alive with movement, noise, and possibility. But for all its brilliance, there was a deeper current moving beneath the surface. A network of whispered alliances, lucrative vices, and shadowy power structures that shaped the city more profoundly than any elected office ever could. It was a world of smoke-filled speakeasies, union bosses who sold their influence for envelopes of cash, police captains who looked the other way, and businessmen who made fortunes from deals they could never publicly acknowledge. New York was not governed solely by laws or institutions. It was governed by leverage, by secrets, by the quiet, calculated influence of men who understood how to manipulate the gears behind the facade of legitimacy. And among these men, no figure was more enigmatic, or more transformative, than Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano did not sit on a throne. He did not declare himself king. He did not march through the streets with soldiers at his back. His power was quieter, more elegant, more dangerous. He ruled from the shadows, shaping the American underworld not with brute force, but with strategy that rivaled the sharpest minds of Wall Street and Washington. In a world driven by fear, ego, and territorial pride, Luciano introduced something entirely new: a vision. He saw the criminal landscape not as a patchwork of gangs battling for scraps, but as an untapped empire, a fragmented industry waiting to be unified. Where others saw turf, he saw markets. Where others clung to tradition, he embraced innovation. Where rivals settled disputes with bullets, he calculated outcomes with the precision of a corporate executive. To understand Luciano is to understand the invisible architecture of power that shaped 20th century America. He stood at the center of the criminal economy during a time when prohibition flooded the streets with opportunity, when corruption seeped into every corner of urban life, and when violence threatened to tear the underworld apart. Yet Luciano, with his quiet intelligence and uncanny sense of timing, brought order to that chaos. He didn't need to be seen to be obeyed. He didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. His authority lived in the system he constructed, in the alliances he forged, and in the certainty that crossing him meant a swift and unseen end. But this story is not merely one of rise and triumph. It is equally a story of reckoning. For every innovation Luciano introduced, the delegation of authority, the profit-sharing that bound soldiers together, the creation of a governing commission, he planted the seeds of his own downfall. The more organized crime became, the more visible its influence became to those who sought to destroy it. The more he strengthened his empire, the more he united the government against him. His structure, so elegant and effective, eventually became the map prosecutors used to dismantle his world. The shadow behind the throne cast a long silhouette, but shadows always lengthen before they disappear. Still, in the 1920s and 1930s, as the city glittered with promise and danger, Luciano's power was undeniable. It lived in the rhythm of the nightlife, in the quiet agreements exchanged behind closed doors, in the political favors purchased with silent nods. It lived in the way gang wars suddenly ceased, replaced by a stability few believed possible. It lived in the disciplined flow of money through gambling dens, speakeasies, brothels, and labor unions. Luciano touched all these worlds without ever needing to stand at the center of them. The brilliance of his rule was that it rarely looked like ruling at all. This book follows the arc of that brilliance, and the cost of it. It follows Luciano's evolution from a streetwise immigrant boy to the architect of the modern American mafia. It examines the innovations that built his empire, the alliances that strengthened it, and the hidden battles that threatened to unravel it. It explores how a man who operated from the shadows became one of the most influential underworld figures in history, and how the very systems he crafted became the instruments of his fall. Above all, this is the story of influence. How one man learned to bend the world not through violence but through vision, not through visibility but through design. As the neon lights of New York flickered through the darkness of the early 20th century, Luciano saw something others did not. He saw that power did not belong to those who shouted the loudest or struck the hardest. It belonged to those who understood the machinery behind the world, the connectors, the brokers, the unseen architects. In that sense, he was not merely a gangster. He was a strategist, a builder, a shadow behind the throne whose ideas outlived him. And as history would reveal, brilliance forged in darkness always casts a profound and lasting light. Before Lucky Luciano emerged as the architect of a new criminal order, The American underworld was a chaotic battlefield, an unruly, fragmented universe where violence ruled more reliably than logic, and power shifted with the volatility of gunfire. To understand the scale of Luciano's transformation, one must first understand the disorder he inherited. A city of gangs without vision in the early decades of the 20th century, New York City was a breeding ground for crime, but not for leadership. Its back alleys, tenement blocks, and waterfront districts crawled with gangs defined not by strategy but by desperation. Irish toughs brawled for pride. Jewish street crews defended corners that offered nothing but fleeting scraps of profit. Italian factions, fractured by old country rivalries, carved up neighborhoods with lines drawn in blood. Crime was not industrial, it was improvisational. There were no systems, no standardized rackets, no coordinated networks. Every gang operated like a rogue storm cell, unpredictable, short-lived, and deadly. Money came in bursts, not streams. Alliances were temporary. Trust was non-existent. Even the most notorious early mobs lacked the organizational spine that later defined the mafia. Their power lived and died on the streets, not in boardrooms or council meetings. Leaders emerged only to be murdered, imprisoned, or dethroned within months. There was no plan for sustainability, only survival. Sicilian roots, American fractures among the Italian immigrants who arrived in New York, the mafia took root as a transplanted idea, but it did not flourish as a coherent system. The traditions of rural Sicily, feuds, blood oaths, and rigid family hierarchies, collided with the reality of a bustling, multicultural metropolis. The mafia in Sicily had thrived on insularity. In America, that insularity became a weakness. Sicilian clans refused to cooperate with Neapolitans or Calabrians. Honor was weaponized to justify vendettas rather than guide strategy. Bosses ruled like village patriarchs, demanding absolute obedience while offering little beyond threats. Loyalty was personal, not structural. Every insult had to be avenged, every slight punished. Violence was not a last resort, it was the first language spoken. This old-world stubbornness crippled their potential. While Prohibition flooded New York with unprecedented criminal opportunity, the Italian mobs were too busy fighting each other to capitalize on it. They were soldiers marching in endless circles, obeying codes that no longer fit the world they lived in. The feuds that choked the future by the 1910s and 1920s, the instability reached a fever pitch. Feuds erupted with clockwork regularity. The Mafia Camorra War decimated entire factions. The Morello family in East Harlem battled Neapolitan rivals from Brooklyn. Bodies disappeared into rivers, alleys, and basements, each killing justified by tradition but devoid of strategy. These were not wars fought for expansion, they were wars fought for pride. Each death created a vacuum. Each vacuum triggered another conflict. Leaders ruled until someone stronger, or more paranoid, removed them. The power map of the underworld shifted so often that no long-term planning was possible. Racketeering operations collapsed under the weight of ego. Gambling dens burned because a soldier disobeyed a capo. Union rackets fell apart because bosses extorted too aggressively or too blindly. New York's criminal world was not a ladder to climb. It was quicksand. Desperation disguised as power. Even the so-called bosses were prisoners of their own outdated codes. Men like Giuseppe Morello, Pellegrino Morano, and Salvatore d'Aquila commanded fear, but not stability. Their leadership styles were rooted in suspicion and bloodline, not competence. A don was powerful only as long as his soldiers feared him. But fear is brittle. One misstep, one betrayal, one missed payment, and entire crews turned. There was no diplomacy, no conflict management, no structure to prevent internal collapse. The strongest organizations were merely the ones that had survived the most gunfights. Underneath the violence, a deeper emotion pulsed: desperation. Criminals sought order even if they couldn't articulate it. They longed for leadership that could bring predictability to their lives. They wanted profits that didn't disappear in a hail of bullets, territories they didn't have to reclaim week after week, and allies they could trust beyond the moment. The underworld wasn't just chaotic, it was exhausted. A landscape begging for order. This era, fractured, bloody, and directionless, created the perfect conditions for a visionary. The criminal world didn't need another warlord. It needed an organizer. Someone who understood that chaos was not a sign of strength, but a symptom of failure. Someone who saw beyond tradition, beyond trivial feuds, beyond the cultural baggage imported from Sicily. By the time Prohibition hit full stride in the 1920s, the opportunities were staggering. But unless the underworld evolved, those opportunities would continue slipping through fingers stained with their own conflict. New York's criminal landscape was a puzzle no one had solved. It needed a mind that could see the full picture. The stage set for a new kind of leader into this chaos stepped Charles Lucky Luciano. He did not rise because the world was orderly enough to support him. He rose because it wasn't. The dysfunction that crippled his predecessors became the clay he shaped into something new. His instincts saw potential where others saw rivalry. His mind recognized patterns others ignored. His ambition thrived in the vacuum created by decades of mismanagement. The world before Luciano was a wilderness, untamed, unstable, and unsustainable. It was a world waiting for structure. A world waiting for vision. A world waiting for someone who understood that power meant more than violence. Luciano didn't merely fill that void. He transformed it. Before Lucky Luciano became the architect of organized crime, he was simply Salvatore Lucania, a young immigrant struggling to survive the unforgiving streets of New York's Lower East Side. His story did not begin with power, it began with hunger. Hunger for stability, for respect, for escape from the grinding anonymity of poverty. These early years forged the instincts that would later reshape the American underworld. The hard birth of an ambition. When the Lucania family arrived in New York in 1906, they were swallowed by a world unlike anything they had known. The Lower East Side was a labyrinth of overcrowded tenements, reeking alleys, bustling pushcarts, and relentless noise. Poverty lived in every corner. Crime seeped through every crack. For young Salvatore, the neighborhood was both a threat and a teacher. He learned quickly that survival required alertness, confidence, and a willingness to defend oneself. School offered little. English frustrated him and teachers dismissed him. The streets, however, spoke a language he understood, opportunity mixed with danger. He watched older boys run errands for gamblers and racketeers. He saw immigrants extorted for protection. He saw men make more in a night running cards or booze than his father earned in weeks. Crime was not a secret, it was a survival strategy. And young Salvatore noticed who thrived, not the strongest but the smartest. Street hustling and teenage rackets. By his early teens, Luciano was hustling for coins, carrying bets, watching doors, delivering packages that always came with the warning, "Don't ask what's inside." He learned the geography of the underworld before he learned the geography of the city. Street corners became classrooms. Bookies, gamblers, and petty thieves became inadvertent mentors. He organized dice games behind buildings. He charged other boys 5 cents a week for protection, a racket that would one day scale into an empire. Even then he understood leverage. Fear could motivate, but fairness kept customers loyal. Luciano rarely bullied unnecessarily. He preferred negotiations, deals, arrangements that benefited both sides. His teenage operations had more structure than the adult gangs around him. Violence, however, was never far. Street fights were common. Knives appeared in arguments without warning. Luciano was beaten badly more than once, each time learning that strength alone was a poor substitute for strategy. He vowed that he would never be powerless again. The first great alliance, Meyer Lansky. One of the defining moments of Luciano's youth came not from violence, but from restraint. Luciano, running his small protection racket, approached a quiet Jewish boy who refused to pay. This boy, Meyer Lansky, met Luciano's threat not with fear, but with a calm intelligence that impressed him. Lansky reasoned that he didn't need protection. He could handle himself. And if Luciano insisted, then maybe Luciano wasn't as smart as he thought. Instead of lashing out, Luciano asked questions. Instead of taking the boy's money, he took note of him. Lansky possessed something rare, a strategic mind. He analyzed problems instead of reacting to them. He viewed crime not as a brawl but as an equation. Luciano recognized instantly that Lansky could be an asset, someone who could complement his street instincts with mathematical clarity. Their unlikely friendship became one of the most influential partnerships in American criminal history. Lansky shaped Luciano's worldview in subtle but lasting ways. Violence is useful but unpredictable. Profit is stable only when strategy guides it. The smartest man, not the loudest, wins. With Lansky, Luciano learned to think several moves ahead, to anticipate repercussions, and to value diplomacy over brute force. It was the beginning of his evolution from street kid to strategist. The firebrand, Bugsy Siegel. If Lansky sharpened Luciano's intellect, Bugsy Siegel fueled his ambition. Siegel was fearless, explosive, and charismatic, a natural enforcer whose reputation grew faster than his temper. Where Lansky thought in numbers, Siegel operated on instinct. He embraced danger with a reckless confidence that was both magnetic and terrifying. Luciano recognized that Siegel's volatility, when properly aimed, could be a powerful weapon. Siegel commanded loyalty, intimidated rivals, and acted without hesitation. He brought muscle to Luciano's vision, allowing Luciano to focus on strategy while Siegel handled enforcement. Together, the trio, Luciano, Lansky, and Siegel, formed a kind of proto-organization long before the mafia itself had structure. They represented a new generation of criminals, diverse in background, united by ambition, and driven not by tradition but by opportunity. Early lessons in power and influence throughout his youth, Luciano learned the principles that would later define his empire. Alliances matter more than lineage. He partnered with Jews and Irishmen long before it was acceptable. Intelligence beats intimidation. The boys who relied solely on fists rarely lasted. Opportunity rewards the prepared. Luciano watched which rackets grew fastest, which men rose, which fell. Violence must be strategic. Chaos destroyed profits. Controlled force protected them. Respect is currency. Luciano learned to balance fear with fairness, creating loyalty instead of rebellion. These lessons forged a mindset unlike that of the old Sicilian bosses. Luciano did not dream of ruling a family. He dreamed of organizing an industry. Ambition rising from the ashes of hardship. By the time Luciano reached adulthood, he had already survived more adversity than many gangsters faced in a lifetime. Poverty, violence, prejudice, these did not break him. They sharpened him. They formed the edges of a mind built for survival and leadership. His ambition did not grow from greed alone. It grew from the chaos he witnessed daily: disorganized gangs, pointless feuds, wasted potential. Luciano saw not just what crime was, but what it could become. The boy who hustled for pennies had become a young man ready to build an empire. By the early 1920s, Lucky Luciano was no longer just a promising street strategist or a rising tough among the city's countless crews. He had become something rarer, a thinker in a world ruled by impulse. The more he observed the criminal landscape around him, the more he saw its flaws: outdated codes, fragmented loyalties, bosses stuck in old-world thinking, and organizations too unstable to capitalize on the economic tidal wave of prohibition. Luciano did not want to survive in that environment. He wanted to transform it. A new kind of criminal mind. While other gang leaders obsessed over territory, bloodlines, and personal vendettas, Luciano obsessed over structure. To him, crime was not chaos, it was an industry waiting to be organized. He looked at the mafia families and saw what no one else dared to articulate. No delegation, no long-term planning, no scalable operations, no cooperation between factions, no true leadership. Only fear masquerading as authority. He knew he could do better. More importantly, he knew crime could do better. Luciano's vision was not simply to rule a family, but to design a system that would outlive any single boss, including himself. That ambition set him apart from the old guard whose power depended on being feared. Luciano wanted power that came from respect, efficiency, and inevitability. The corporate blueprint. Luciano's transformation began with the quiet construction of a new model, one borrowed from legitimate businesses. He introduced 1. Divisions of labor. Instead of leaving each capo to run whatever racket he wished, Luciano organized operations into clear categories: gambling, bootlegging, prostitution, narcotics, labor, racketeering. Each sector had appointed managers who monitored profits, settled disputes, and reported regularly. This eliminated overlap, reduced conflict, and stabilized revenue. 2. Oversight and accountability. Luciano required regular communication between lieutenants. No decision of significance was made in isolation. Meetings became standard, books were informally kept, and performance was tracked. This was revolutionary in an underworld previously ruled by haphazard guesswork and ego. 3. A leadership structure above the families. Luciano understood that individual bosses could no longer dictate terms without creating chaos. What crime needed was something akin to a board of directors, a place where leaders could negotiate instead of kill. The seeds of this idea would later flower into the commission. But even early on, Luciano treated the underworld like a business whose survival depended on collaboration. To some, this was blasphemy. To Luciano, it was evolution. Alliances rooted in trust and necessity. No empire is built alone. Luciano surrounded himself with allies who complemented his strengths and compensated for his weaknesses. Meyer Lansky, the strategist. Lansky's analytic mind helped refine Luciano's corporate-style structure. His talent for numbers and foresight made gambling and financial operations far more sophisticated than the crude rackets of previous eras. Lansky was not just an ally, he was a co-architect. Bugsy Siegel, the force of nature. Where Lansky offered calculation, Siegel offered force. Charismatic, fearless, and often volatile, He ensured that Luciano's reforms were enforced. Violence under Luciano became targeted, not theatrical. Siegel embodied that shift, dangerous but disciplined when it mattered. Frank Costello, the diplomat Costello wielded influence with politicians the way Luciano wielded influence in the streets. He understood people in power, and he could open doors that brute force never could. Luciano's empire needed legitimacy in the shadows. Costello provided it. Vito Genovese, the ambitious executor Genovese, brought a ruthless practicality that Luciano used strategically, though never fully trusted. Genovese would ultimately become both ally and rival, but in the early years he helped enforce Luciano's model across reluctant factions. Each ally brought something essential. Together they formed a leadership core more dynamic and effective than any mafia faction before them. Rising above the old guard as Luciano's network grew, so too did tension with the old world bosses, particularly Joe Masuria and later Salvatore Maranzano. These men clung to tradition and hierarchy. They ruled through fear, demanded blind loyalty, and resisted cooperation with non-Sicilians. To Luciano they represented everything stunting the growth of organized crime. He saw the old guard as obstacles, not mentors. Their wars cost money. Their rigidity cost opportunity. Their egos cost stability. Luciano knew that if he wanted to build the empire in his mind, he had to rise above them, not with brute force alone, but with strategy that made their methods obsolete. His alliances with Lansky, Siegel, and other non-Italian figures were not merely friendships, they were statements. Luciano believed the future of crime was multi-ethnic, collaborative, and nationwide. The old bosses believed it was Sicilian, insular, and local. The collision was inevitable. The birth of a vision larger than crime. By his late 20s, Luciano was no longer simply participating in the underworld. He was reshaping it. He dismantled barriers between ethnic groups, formalized operations that had once been improvised, and introduced oversight in a world that had survived on volatility. He built the first genuine criminal infrastructure in America, one capable of expansion, innovation, and survival far beyond the lifespan of any individual leader. Luciano didn't seek control for control's sake. He sought to create a system, one that made crime predictable, scalable, and profitable on a level never before imagined. His vision reached far beyond territory or titles. It was a vision of order replacing chaos, cooperation replacing vendetta, structure replacing instinct. And in that vision, Luciano became something unprecedented. Not just a criminal leader but the architect of an empire. Long before Lucky Luciano reorganized the mafia into a modern syndicate, one ancient force governed its members with an authority more absolute than any boss. Omerta, the code of silence. Born from centuries of Sicilian oppression, Omerta was more than a rule. It was a worldview, an understanding that survival depended on secrecy, loyalty, and a refusal to submit to outside powers. In Sicily, Omerta protected peasants from corrupt landlords and foreign conquerors. In America, it became the backbone of the criminal underworld. Yet under Luciano, Omerta took on a more sophisticated function. He both respected the ancient code and manipulated it with psychological brilliance, transforming it into a mechanism of control that bound his empire more tightly than any contract could. The cultural weight of silence. To understand the power of Omerta, one must understand the psychology behind it. Silence in the mafia was not merely practical, it was sacred. Speaking to authorities was not betrayal, it was a kind of death. It meant surrendering honor, surrendering identity, surrendering the brotherhood that defined a man's place in the world. Omerta declared, "The state cannot be trusted. Justice is handled privately, not publicly. Loyalty is owed to the family, not the law. A man's worth is measured by his ability to endure suffering without speaking." This code created a potent emotional ecosystem. Men were shaped from youth to believe that silence was strength, that cooperation with outsiders was shame, and that loyalty was a moral obligation written in blood. For Luciano this was invaluable. A system that encouraged unquestioning loyalty meant a system that could be organized, expanded, and sustained. But Luciano did not simply inherit Omerta. He refined it. Respecting the old ways, with purpose. Luciano understood that Omerta could not be discarded. It was too deeply ingrained, too central to Italian-American identity, and too useful in preventing defections. But he also recognized that the rigid old-world interpretation of Omerta had limitations. Traditional bosses demanded silent loyalty based on fear and heritage. Luciano demanded silent loyalty based on structure, efficiency, and opportunity. To Luciano, Omerta was not merely a cultural relic. It was a business necessity. Silence protected operations. Silence shielded leadership. Silence allowed expansion without exposure. Luciano respected the code because it fortified the system he was building. Yet he also molded it into something more modern, more strategic, and far more effective. Manipulating silence. Discipline through psychology. Luciano's brilliance lay in understanding that control required more than punishment. It required psychological architecture, beliefs that governed behavior even when he wasn't present. Fear and consequence. Luciano never hid the consequences of betrayal. Breaking omerta wasn't just a crime, it was a death sentence. But the executions carried out under his leadership were not wild displays meant to instill terror. They were surgical, necessary, and always explained. He wanted his men to understand something profound. Silence was the price of belonging. Breaking it was the forfeit of one's life. This was not arbitrary violence. It was calibrated discipline. Respect as a weapon. While fear enforced omerta, respect sustained it. Luciano treated capable men with dignity. He listened, mediated disputes, rewarded loyalty with money and influence, and rarely humiliated subordinates. He understood that a man who felt respected would protect the system because it protected him. In this sense, omerta became a two-sided psychological bond. Fear ensured men didn't break the code. Respect ensured they didn't want to. This duality was Luciano's innovation. Old bosses ruled through fear alone. Luciano ruled through fear balanced with value. The domino effect of loyalty. Under Luciano, loyalty became systemic. A soldier followed his capo not only out of fear, but because the structure offered him predictable income, defined roles, and upward mobility. A capo remained loyal to the boss because he saw the benefits of structure, stability, protection, and opportunity. Luciano turned omerta into part of the organizational design. Breaking silence was not merely breaking loyalty, it was breaking the entire machinery of profit. He made loyalty logical. He made silence economical. He made omerta not only a moral duty, but a smart decision. The psychological cost of silence. But omerta came at a cost. A deep psychological burden worn by every man in the organization. Silence demanded compartmentalization. It demanded the burying of emotions, the severing of conscience, the acceptance that betrayal of the outside world was virtue and that loyalty to the family was absolute. For many men, this created fractures. Guilt that could never be spoken, fear that could never be admitted, isolation from loved ones, a constant sense of being watched. By enemies, by police, by their own brothers. Luciano understood these pressures. He reinforced brotherhood through rituals, meetings, celebrations, and shared financial success. He knew that a man who felt emotionally anchored to the group was far less likely to break the code. But even with these bonds, the psychological weight remained heavy. Silence was protection. Silence was power. But silence was also a prison. Breaking silence meant breaking yourself. Under Luciano, breaking omerta became existential. A man who spoke to authorities was not merely betraying the boss, he was betraying the identity Luciano had built for him. To become an informant meant losing your family, losing your reputation, losing your place in the moral hierarchy, becoming a hunted man. Luciano structured the mafia so that omerta wasn't just a rule, it was a self-identity. To violate it meant severing yourself from the only world you truly belonged to. In this way, Luciano weaponized psychology as effectively as any gun. Omerta as the empire's foundation. Silence and loyalty were not incidental to Luciano's empire, they were its foundation. They allowed him to build a corporate-style syndicate without leaks, without mutiny, and without sabotage. They protected him more effectively than bodyguards. They allowed him to rule without visibility, influence without exposure. Omerta was the invisible armor of Luciano's empire. And it was the iron chain binding every man to the system he created. By the time Lucky Luciano rose to true prominence, the American underworld was bursting with opportunity but drowning in disorder. Prohibition had created a tidal wave of profit, yet most gangs lacked the discipline or foresight to seize it sustainably. They fought over scraps, sabotaged one another, and treated vice like a short-term hustle. Luciano saw something they didn't. Crime could be industrialized. To him, the underworld was not a battlefield. It was a marketplace. Not a patchwork of rackets. But an economy, one he intended to organize, expand, and control. Luciano didn't just run operations. He built industries. Prostitution, a franchise before franchises existed before Luciano. Prostitution in New York was chaotic. Individual pimps, scattered brothels, and constant turnover. It was a business with demand but no management, no quality control, and no scalability. Luciano changed that. He reorganized prostitution as a franchise-style network with Brothel managers acting like storefront supervisors, collectors who gathered earnings and ensured compliance, standard pricing to eliminate undercutting, protection crews assigned to specific districts, health checks to maintain product reliability, rotation systems to prevent police familiarity. Each brothel functioned like a branch of a larger corporation. Earnings were predictable, oversight was standardized, and risks were minimized. Luciano's managers tracked revenue, monitored worker behavior, and reported up the chain just as a legitimate business would. For Luciano, prostitution wasn't a moral question. It was recurring income, the kind corporations now call subscription revenue. A steady flow of cash allowed his empire to weather legal crackdowns, turf disputes, and market fluctuations. Gambling, the underworld's financial institution. Gambling had always been profitable, but it was riddled with inconsistencies, cheating operators, unreliable odds, and constant raids. Luciano approached gambling like a banker turned strategist turned mathematician. With Meyer Lansky as his right hand, gambling became an engine of financial predictability. Under Luciano and Lansky, gambling operations introduced standardized odds and betting structures, central accounting systems, profit sharing among stakeholders, regular payouts to avoid internal theft, mathematically optimized games to guarantee house profit. The duo transformed gambling dens from smoky backroom casinos into financial machines, capable of generating revenue with stability rivaling Wall Street operations. Luciano understood that trust, ironically, was essential for illegal gambling to flourish. People bet more when they believed the system wasn't rigged. So he took chaos and replaced it with confidence. He took greed and replaced it with math. Narcotics. The global supply chain. Narcotics were riskier, more controversial, and more heavily policed. Many old-world bosses avoided them out of fear or tradition. Luciano understood that ignoring narcotics was not morality, it was lost opportunity. He set up a global supply chain decades before such terminology entered legitimate business. His system connected Sicilian suppliers who facilitated international transport, Turkish and Asian heroin producers feeding the raw product, European intermediaries who laundered shipments through ports, Caribbean smugglers who handled transatlantic transfers, American distributors organized into tiers, from wholesalers to street sellers. This layered structure mirrored legitimate logistics companies. No single group controlled the entire pipeline, and no single leak could expose the entire network. Luciano did not handle the drugs himself, he handled the architecture. Under him, narcotics became predictable, scalable, manageable. It was one of his most controversial decisions, but also one of his most strategically brilliant. A high-risk, high-profit division run with corporate efficiency. Labor racketeering, influence wrapped in legitimacy. Unlike prostitution or narcotics, labor racketeering existed in the gray zone between crime and legitimate influence. Luciano recognized its power immediately. Unions controlled construction, shipping, trucking, and manufacturing. Controlling unions meant controlling the backbone of the city. Luciano infiltrated unions with subtlety. Union bosses were bribed, threatened, or replaced. Work stoppages became bargaining tools. Companies paid for labor peace, creating recurring revenue. Contracts were steered toward mafia-controlled businesses. This racket was elegant because it looked legitimate. It tied criminal influence directly to the economy without attracting the same attention that gambling or prostitution did. Labor racketeering was Luciano's long game, a source of profit and political leverage. Protection rackets, subscription crime. Perhaps Luciano's simplest innovation was also one of his most profitable. Regularized protection fees. Gone were the days of random shakedowns and unpredictable extortion. Businesses paid weekly or monthly rates in exchange for guaranteed safety, mediation of disputes, protection from rival criminals, stability in neighborhoods. Luciano turned extortion into a service. A predictable service with predictable revenue. Many merchants even preferred paying him over relying on the corrupt or overwhelmed police. He offered results, swift, decisive, and cost-effective. The genius of Luciano's empire. Crime as business. What made Luciano unprecedented was the connective tissue he created between all these industries. They did not operate independently. They supported one another. Income from prostitution funded bribes. Gambling profits financed expansion. Labor racketeering provided political leverage. Narcotics revenues powered national growth. Protection rackets stabilized the streets where other rackets operated. Luciano built an ecosystem, not a collection of schemes. The empire worked because it had structured delegation, predictable income, clear oversight, cooperation across families, long-term planning. He thought like a CEO decades before the underworld even understood the word. To Luciano, crime was not rebellion. It was a business model. A way to turn vice into industry, chaos into economy, influence into empire. And it worked, so well that even after his downfall, the system he built continued to operate for generations. As Lucky Luciano's influence expanded, he entered a world where power was not claimed, it was contested. Every alliance had an expiration date, every partnership carried hidden conditions, and every handshake risked concealing a blade. Luciano's brilliance elevated him above the street-level brutality that dominated early mafia life, but it also placed him in the crosshairs of men who resented his modern vision or feared what it meant for their own futures. His ascent created a delicate equilibrium, one that required constant calculation, diplomacy, and ruthlessness. And orbiting him were four figures who defined that fragile balance: Joe Masuria, Salvatore Maranzano, Dutch Schultz, and Vito Genovese. Each man represented a different threat. Each man forced Luciano to sharpen his strategy. And each man revealed just how treacherous the path to power truly was. Joe Masuria, the last king of the old world to many young Italian gangsters. Joe, the boss Masuria, was a towering figure. The quintessential mafia patriarch, feared for his brutality and respected for his willingness to use it. But to Luciano, Masuria represented something else entirely. A relic, a stubborn artifact of an old-world mafia that had no place in the future he envisioned. Masuria demanded loyalty without negotiation, tribute without justification, and obedience without exception. He clung to Sicilian tradition like armor, convinced that the same rigid codes that ruled the villages of his youth would hold together the sprawling criminal landscape of New York. But in truth, his leadership style stunted growth and invited chaos. Under Masuria, wars erupted without strategy. Profits were squandered in petty disputes. Non-Sicilian alliances were forbidden, limiting expansion. Luciano, chafing under these constraints, realized that Masuria's tyranny was not just annoying, it was crippling. The young strategist played the role of loyal lieutenant while quietly building alliances outside Masuria's rigid world. He knew that if crime was going to evolve, the old king would have to fall. But dethroning a king meant stepping onto a battlefield soaked in blood. Salvatore Maranzano, the visionary turned autocrat. If Masuria represented the past, Salvatore Maranzano represented a dangerous alternative future. Maranzano was intelligent, calculating, and far more strategic than most bosses of his era. He admired Caesar, studied military tactics, and envisioned a mafia structured with discipline and hierarchy. In another life, he and Luciano might have been allies. But Maranzano was not interested in shared power. He wanted absolute power. When the Castellamarese War erupted between Masuria's forces and Maranzano's faction, Luciano found himself caught between two leaders, one outdated, one overly ambitious. Ultimately, he sided with Maranzano, orchestrating Masuria's assassination and helping Maranzano claim victory. But the victory proved hollow. Maranzano immediately declared himself Capo di Tutti Capi, boss of all bosses, a title Luciano despised because it resurrected the very autocracy he sought to eliminate. Worse, Maranzano saw Luciano's ambition and intelligence as threats. Within months, whispers spread. Maranzano was planning Luciano's assassination. Luciano learned a vital truth: a brilliant leader can be just as dangerous as a foolish one, if he cannot share power. To survive, Luciano had to remove the man he had helped elevate. And in doing so, he cleared the final obstacle to reshaping the mafia into a cooperative syndicate rather than a monarchy. Dutch Schultz, the unpredictable wild card. While Luciano maneuvered carefully among Sicilian leaders, another threat rose outside the mafia's traditional structure. Dutch Schultz, a volatile Jewish gangster whose empire seemed held together by sheer brutality and paranoia. Schultz had built a fortune in bootlegging and numbers rackets, but he was too reckless to maintain it. His temper led to unnecessary killings, his defiance of mafia authority sparked rifts, and his growing desperation led him to consider the unthinkable, assassinating prosecutor Thomas Dewey, the rising legal star chasing New York's organized crime. To Luciano, this was madness. Dewey was dangerous enough without provocation. Killing him would unleash the full force of the American justice system. Luciano knew the mafia could survive wars with rival gangs, but it could not survive a war with the state. Schultz's recklessness threatened not just Luciano's operations, but the entire criminal economy. And so, the underworld reached a rare consensus. Schultz had to be eliminated before he dragged everyone down with him. His death was not personal. It was strategic. A necessary act of stabilization, not unlike removing a faulty cog from a delicate machine. Vito Genovese, the ally with a shadowed ambition among Luciano's closest peers, None cast a longer or more ominous shadow than Vito Genovese. He was loyal, effective, and ruthless, an ally Luciano depended on and distrusted in equal measure. Genovese understood Luciano's vision and supported many of his reforms. He enforced discipline, managed key operations, and displayed a keen instinct for expanding influence. But beneath this cooperation lay a restless ambition. Genovese wanted power, not shared influence, not balanced leadership, but personal dominance. Luciano saw the future threat even before Genovese acted on it. He kept Genovese close enough to use but far enough to monitor. Their alliance was built on function, not trust. In Genovese, Luciano faced a reflection of what he might have become had he pursued power for power's sake, rather than for the sake of building a system. A world built on fragile alliances. Luciano's rise was not a smooth ascent but a gauntlet. Every step forward required navigating a minefield of egos, ambitions, and dangers. He had to survive the old guard, outmaneuver rivals, control wild cards like Schultz, anticipate betrayals from within his own circle. He rose not simply because he was smarter, but because he understood a truth the old bosses never grasped. Power is not secured through violence alone, it is secured through balance. Balance of alliances. Balance of ambition. Balance of fear and respect. Luciano thrived because he mastered that balance. But he knew better than anyone how easily it could shatter. Before Lucky Luciano could build his empire, he had to survive the most violent, treacherous, and defining conflict in mafia history, the Castellammarese War. On the surface, it was a brutal struggle between two Sicilian factions, Joe Masuria's Manhattan stronghold and Salvatore Maranzano's Castellammarese loyalists. But beneath the gunfire and ambushes, a quieter war raged. It was a war of whispered deals, hidden negotiations, and silent betrayals. Luciano walked this shadowed path with the calm precision of a man who understood that survival required more than bullets. It required vision. The war dragged New York's underworld into chaos. Brothers turned on brothers. Businesses collapsed under the weight of fear. Every street corner felt like an execution site waiting to be claimed. Luciano, caught between two bosses who mistrusted him as much as they relied on him, lived each day under the threat of death. Yet instead of retreating, he used the conflict as an opportunity to reshape the future of organized crime. The old order explodes at the war's outset. Masuria, stubborn, proud, and increasingly paranoid, believed he could crush the rising Castellammarese rivals through brute force. Maranzano, colder and more strategic, saw the conflict as a cleansing, an opportunity to rebuild the mafia under his disciplined command. The old guard saw war as tradition. Luciano saw it as weakness. He watched as both factions bled money, soldiers, and influence. The war was destroying the very thing they claimed to protect. Every ambush, every retaliation pushed the underworld further into instability, exactly the environment Luciano wanted to escape. He knew that if he aligned fully with one side, he would be trapped in a dying system. So instead he carved out a third path. Not loyalty, not rebellion, but survival through strategy. Negotiations in the shadows. While publicly acting as Masuria's loyal lieutenant, Luciano quietly opened channels of communication with Maranzano's camp. This was a deadly gamble. If Masuria discovered the betrayal, Luciano would be executed. If Maranzano doubted his sincerity, Luciano would be eliminated as a useless pawn. Every conversation required perfect calm. Luciano lied with conviction, told truths with caution, and waited for the war to exhaust both leaders enough to need him. He proposed a radical idea during these secret talks: end the war, share the power, build a new structure that would allow both factions to thrive. Maranzano listened, intrigued but mistrustful. Masuria, however, grew increasingly suspicious of Luciano's long absences and diplomatic tone. Luciano could feel death tightening around him, but he remained still, playing both sides without fully committing to either. Few men in mafia history walked such a narrow ledge without falling. The near-death lesson in 1931, Luciano's balancing act nearly ended in the East River. Masuria, convinced Luciano was hiding something, ordered him to accompany two gunmen on a routine drive. Luciano understood instantly. This was an execution. The drive turned into a beating, the beating into an abduction, and soon Luciano found himself bound, stabbed, and dumped in a deserted marshland. Only a strange twist of fate, a passerby mistaking him for injured rather than dead, saved his life. The scars from that night stayed with him for the rest of his life. Not just the physical ones but the psychological ones. Luciano realized something crucial: the old system would kill him before it ever allowed him to fix it. The war was not just a battlefield. It was a prison and he needed to escape. This near-death experience hardened Luciano's resolve. He would not merely survive the Castellamarese War, he would use it to destroy the old order and build the new one. The betrayal that ended a kingdom. Luciano's decision became inevitable. Masuria could not be reasoned with. His paranoia and rigidity made him a danger to everything Luciano hoped to create. Quietly, Luciano sealed the old boss's fate. On April 15, 1931, Luciano lured Masuria to a Coney Island restaurant under the guise of a friendly afternoon. While they played cards, Luciano excused himself to the restroom. In his absence, gunmen entered and executed Masuria with chilling precision. It was not an act of loyalty to Maranzano. It was an act of loyalty to the future. With Masuria dead, the war appeared over. Maranzano took power, declared victory, and began reorganizing the mafia into a rigid Roman-style hierarchy. Luciano initially cooperated, but he had seen enough of Maranzano during the conflict to know one truth: Maranzano was only a better tyrant, not a better leader. When Luciano learned Maranzano planned to eliminate him next, his course became clear. The war that began with chaos would end with strategy. The quiet coup that built an empire. Luciano arranged Maranzano's assassination the same way he had helped arrange Masuria's: cleanly, quietly, and without unnecessary spectacle. When the dust settled, both leaders of the Castellamarese War were dead. But Luciano did not claim the throne. He destroyed it. In the vacuum that followed, he introduced the structure that would define the mafia for generations: the Commission, a governing council that replaced autocracy with shared power. The war had shown him that no single boss could control New York without triggering violence. Stability required cooperation, not crowns. Luciano's subtle leadership throughout the conflict revealed his genius. He made alliances instead of demands. He mediated instead of escalating. He used betrayal not as punishment but as strategy. He survived by thinking like a builder, not a warrior. The Castellamarese War had been a crucible. Luciano emerged not as a survivor but as a visionary. The hidden war beneath the bullets, the war of influence, diplomacy, and quiet ambition, was the war he truly won. For years, Lucky Luciano had ruled without appearing to rule. He existed in the margins, in the whispered deals, in the unseen decisions that shaped the American underworld. He built a system so efficient, so quiet, so meticulously structured that many believed he was untouchable. Luciano was the shadow no light could fully expose. But shadows stretch. And in stretching they become visible. By the mid-1930s, the forces gathering against Luciano were unlike anything he had faced from rival gangsters. They were not born of vendetta or ambition. They were born of politics, morality, public outrage, and the growing recognition that organized crime had evolved into something far more dangerous than street-level vice. Luciano's empire, once invisible, now appeared to reformers as the unseen machinery corrupting New York City itself. The fall of the Shadow King began not with a single betrayal, but with a convergence of pressures: political crusaders seeking fame, informants desperate to survive, and rivals eager to reshape the balance of power. Luciano had thrived in darkness. Now the world was preparing to turn on the lights. The moral crusaders' rise. The Great Depression did more than cripple the American economy, it ignited a cultural shift. Politicians, journalists, and middle-class reformers demanded accountability from the institutions that had allowed vice to flourish. Prostitution, gambling, and racketeering were no longer dismissed as urban inevitabilities. They were framed as parasites feeding on a suffering population. Newspapers fanned the flames. Headlines condemned the vice syndicates draining the city. Editorials demanded a clean sweep of corruption. Reform leagues held rallies. What had once been tolerated as part of city life was now condemned as moral rot. And at the center of the rhetoric, never named outright but implied, was the mastermind behind it all, the man the press whispered about without proof: Lucky Luciano. He was becoming the symbol of a disease New York wanted cured. Political ambition finds its target into this shifting landscape. Stepped Thomas E. Dewey, a young, relentless prosecutor with ambitions far beyond the courtroom. Dewey recognized that tackling petty criminals would earn him small headlines. Dismantling the vice empire would make him a national figure. He understood something fundamental. People did not want criminals arrested. They wanted evil defeated. And Luciano was the perfect villain. Dewey's team spent months gathering fragments: financial records, street rumors, brothel testimonies, whispered allegations. None of it directly implicated Luciano. But Dewey didn't need proof at first. He needed momentum. He needed the public to believe that a Shadow King existed, and that he was coming for him. Every raid, every arrest, Every moralistic speech was crafted to build a narrative. Crime had become an empire, and an empire had an emperor. Luciano felt the pressure tightening, like a fishing line dragging steadily against the currents he had long controlled. He sensed the shift but underestimated its scale. The first cracks, informants and fear for a decade, Omerta had shielded Luciano better than any bodyguard. His structure minimized exposure. His intermediaries insulated him from incriminating contact. But the prostitution network, vast, profitable, and loosely managed by necessity, became the weak point Dewey needed. When Dewey's investigators launched a series of coordinated raids in 1935 and early 1936, dozens of madams, prostitutes, and collectors were arrested. Most faced charges severe enough to destroy their lives. Few had loyalty to the mafia. Fewer still could afford silence. And under the pressure of Dewey's interrogations, the first cracks appeared. A madam spoke of higher-ups. A collector described weekly payments. A frightened worker whispered that everybody answers to a boss called Charlie. None of the testimonies were perfect and many were contradictory. Some were coerced. Others were exaggerated. But collectively they formed a narrative that Dewey seized upon. Luciano wasn't just involved, he was directing the entire prostitution syndicate. This was the moment the shadow began to take shape in the public mind. Even before his arrest he felt exposed. But worse was coming. Betrayals in the ranks while informants eroded the bottom of his empire, strategic betrayal gnawed at the top. Some allies quietly distanced themselves, wary that Luciano's impending storm could sweep them away with him. Others subtly redirected responsibility, ensuring that if Dewey demanded a head, Luciano's would be easiest to offer. Even Vito Genovese, long a loyal lieutenant but always an ambitious one, saw opportunity in Luciano's vulnerability. Though not directly betraying him, Genovese provided no support, no interference, no resistance as Dewey closed in. His silence was a calculation. If Luciano fell, a new vacuum would open. Luciano was not blind to these shifts. The emotional shock was not in the betrayals themselves, he expected betrayal. It was in the realization that his influence, so carefully woven, was fraying in critical places. His power had always depended on his invisibility. Now he was becoming visible. Exposure was more dangerous than any rival. Dragged into the light in April 1936, Dewey made his move. Luciano was arrested at the Roosevelt Hotel, the moment orchestrated with maximum press coverage. Flashbulbs exploded. Reporters swarmed. Headlines declared him the Vice King of New York. For a man who had always ruled from the shadows, the humiliation was profound. He was paraded through the courthouse like a trophy, put on display as the embodiment of organized vice. The quiet strategist now faced a trial fueled by spectacle. Luciano, who had built an empire on control, suddenly felt the weight of forces he could not manipulate. Public outrage, political ambition, a legal machine designed to destroy symbols, not men witnesses who barely knew him but would be believed anyway. This was not a war he could fight with alliances. This was not a conflict he could end with strategy alone. The reckoning he had avoided for years, through brilliance, influence and silence, had finally arrived. The beginning of the end. The arrest marked the first fracture in Luciano's reign, but the emotional blow cut deeper. For the first time he saw the limits of the empire he built. The shadows had protected him, but they had also hidden the growing movement against him. Now exposed, he was vulnerable in ways he had never imagined. The fall of Lucky Luciano did not happen in one moment, it happened through 1,000 small shifts. A frightened woman's testimony. A prosecutor's ambition. A friend's silence. A public hungry for salvation. The Shadow King had been pulled into the light. And light, as Luciano now understood, was far more dangerous than gunfire. The courthouse smelled of sweat, ink and spectacle, an arena more theatrical than judicial. When Lucky Luciano entered it in the summer of 1936, he did so not as the invisible strategist who had shaped the American underworld, but as a man dragged forcibly into the light. His arrest had been a headline. His trial became a national fixation. For prosecutor Thomas Dewey, this was not merely a legal battle. It was a moral crusade. To him, Luciano was not just a criminal, he was the symbol of everything rotten in the American city: vice flourishing in the shadows, corruption poisoning institutions, and violence masked by sophistication. Dewey intended to expose him not only to the court, but to the entire nation. And the courtroom responded exactly as Dewey hoped. Reporters filled the benches like vultures waiting for the scent of blood. Flashbulbs punctuated every gesture. Editorialists sharpened their pens to cast Luciano as the architect of moral decay. The trial began long before the opening statements. It began the moment his photograph hit the front page. The Shadow King was about to be judged in the brightest spotlight he had ever faced. A case built on narrative, not evidence. Dewey understood something essential. To convict Luciano, he did not need irrefutable proof. He needed a story, a villain the jury could fear and the public could condemn. Luciano, with his intelligence, his elegance, his reputation for quiet control, fit that role perfectly. The prosecution's case rested heavily on testimonies from prostitutes, madams, pimps and low-level operatives swept up in Dewey's raids. Many of these witnesses had motives for cooperation, leniency, protection, or the desperate desire to escape the life they inhabited. Their accounts were scattered, inconsistent, and at times contradictory. But Dewey did not present them as individual stories. He braided them together into a narrative. There was a system. That system was organized. And at its head sat Charles Lucky Luciano. Dewey spoke of national vice syndicates, of corporate-style exploitation, of an invisible mastermind who pulled strings from behind the curtain. He painted Luciano not as a street boss but as a CEO of corruption. The irony was suffocating. Luciano's greatest innovation, organization, was now being used as evidence of his guilt. Witnesses become weapons. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Some trembled. Some embellished. Some lied with conviction. Others seemed caught between fear of the underworld and fear of the state. Dewey led them carefully, extracting phrases the press could seize on. He set the rules. We all worked for Charlie. No one crossed him. Most of these witnesses had never met Luciano. Some didn't know his face. But Dewey didn't need direct interaction. He needed implication. He needed the suggestion that Luciano's influence permeated the entire structure. Luciano's attorneys objected repeatedly, pointing out inconsistencies and the absence of hard evidence. But Dewey countered with a rhetorical hammer. A man who rules from shadows does not sign documents. The jury nodded. The reporters scribbled. The story hardened. Omerta. His shield becomes his shackles as the prosecution built its case through implication and narrative. Luciano's greatest defense. Omerta, the code of silence, became his greatest liability. In the past, Omerta protected him. It insulated him from exposure. It kept his name out of operations. But in court, that invisibility looked like guilt. Luciano refused to name associates, refused to explain his finances, refused to answer questions that could incriminate others. This silence, required by his own code, made him appear evasive. To jurors unfamiliar with mafia culture, silence equaled guilt. Where Dewey wanted names, Luciano gave none. Where Dewey demanded details, Luciano avoided them. Where the court expected explanations, Luciano provided only denials. But Omerta allowed nothing else. For the first time in his life, silence was not power. It was vulnerability. Luciano watched as Dewey weaponized that silence against him, framing it as proof of control, proof of secrecy, proof of a mastermind who feared the truth. He saw the jurors lean forward, saw the public's appetite sharpen. He felt the weight of a system turning against him. And for the first time he wondered if the code he had built his empire upon might be the very thing that would destroy him. The press turns a man into a myth outside the courtroom. The media built Luciano into a monster. Headlines described him as the vice king, the puppet master, the brain of the underworld. The real Luciano, calm, strategic, soft-spoken, was replaced with a caricature that suited the public's hunger for righteous punishment. Editorials called for his imprisonment as a cleansing of the city's moral fabric. Politicians demanded action. Reformers declared the trial a turning point in American virtue. The courtroom had jurors, but the streets had already chosen their verdict. Luciano became not a man on trial but an idea, the embodiment of organized sin. The verdict and the symbolic sentence on June 18, 1936, the jury returned with its decision. Guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. Luciano did not flinch, though inside he felt a blow unlike any he had endured. It wasn't just the verdict, it was what it represented. The shadows he had ruled from had finally betrayed him. Judge Philip J. McCook delivered the sentence with theatrical gravity, 30 to 50 years in prison. The courtroom erupted. Dewey's triumph was complete. The public celebrated. Reformers applauded. The state had toppled its symbol of corruption. Luciano, the architect of modern organized crime, was led away in chains. The symbolism was unmistakable. The government had not merely imprisoned a criminal. It had declared war on the system he created. For Luciano, It was the beginning of a reckoning he could not negotiate, manipulate, or escape. When the prison gates clanged shut behind Lucky Luciano in 1936, many believed they were not merely locking away a man, they were locking away an era. Prosecutor Thomas Dewey presented Luciano's sentence as the end of organized crime's invisible empire. Newspapers declared that the vice king had been dethroned. Reformers celebrated the triumph of law over corruption. But in truth, the only thing that changed was Luciano's geography. His influence, quiet, strategic, and deeply woven into the structure he had built, did not disappear. It simply adapted. A strategist enters confinement. Luciano arrived at Clinton Correctional Facility, Dannemora, a cold, imposing fortress in northern New York known for breaking spirits. Guards expected him to fail, expected the elegant mob boss to collapse under monotony, isolation, and the slow erosion of power. Instead, Luciano treated prison as he had treated the streets of the Lower East Side, a hostile environment that could be studied, understood, and navigated. He watched, listened, observed routines, and mapped relationships. Prison was not freedom, but it was a system, and systems could be influenced. The first shift in his mindset came quickly. He was no longer the ruler of New York's underworld. He was no longer the architect with a city at his feet. But he was still Luciano. And Luciano's strength had never been proximity, it had always been strategy. He understood something essential. Mobility had been taken from him, but influence was portable. Maintaining control through loyalty. Luciano's empire had not been built on fear alone. It had been built on structure, delegation, hierarchy, and loyalty reinforced through profit and respect. Those mechanisms did not vanish when he entered prison. If anything, they became more important. Trusted lieutenants like Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Albert Anastasia continued to visit. These meetings were monitored, but the guards could not monitor tone, implication, or the subtleties of coded conversation. Luciano avoided direct orders. That would have been reckless. But he offered guidance. Who to trust, who to avoid, which disputes needed calming, which ventures required expansion, and perhaps most importantly, he offered continuity. His lieutenants left their prison visits not with commands but with clarity. Luciano's strength had always been the clarity of his vision. In prison, that vision became a beacon guiding the men who had inherited the streets. He was no longer the boss in person. He was the strategist in exile. The commission protects its architect. Years earlier, Luciano had created the commission to stabilize the mafia and prevent warfare between families. Now it served another purpose, preserving his legacy and protecting his relevance. The structure he built ensured that no single boss could replace him outright. Power was balanced across several leaders with incentive to maintain his system. His allies maintained their authority through his endorsement. Even from a prison cell, Luciano remained a symbolic pillar. The commission still referenced his ideas, still considered his perspective, still respected the man who had given them stability. The brilliance of Luciano's leadership became unmistakable in confinement. He had built an empire so well that it did not collapse without him. The psychological evolution. Ruler to remote strategist in prison, Luciano underwent a personal transformation. He was still ambitious, still calculating, but no longer driven by the need to dominate. The absence of daily criminal pressure allowed space for reflection. He recognized the limits of his power. He acknowledged mistakes that once would have been unthinkable. He accepted that the empire would evolve without him, and yet remain his creation. Far from breaking him, prison refined him. He became introspective, even philosophical. Visitors noted that he seemed calmer, more deliberate, as though confinement had stripped away impulse and left only intention. He was no longer the king in the shadows. He was the advisor behind the curtain. World War II changes everything. In 1942, an unexpected turn of events pulled Luciano back into national significance. With German submarines attacking ships off the East Coast and rumors of sabotage on New York docks, the U.S. Navy faced a terrifying possibility: enemy infiltration in the very ports supplying the war effort. The U.S. government needed cooperation from the longshoremen and dockside crews, groups heavily influenced by the mafia. And there was only one man whose approval could guarantee that cooperation: Lucky Luciano. Despite being a prisoner, Luciano still commanded immense respect among dockside labor and the underworld controlling the waterfront. Naval intelligence, through intermediaries like attorney Moses Polikoff and gangster Meyer Lansky, opened quiet negotiations. Luciano listened. Not for patriotism, though he later claimed pride in helping the U.S., but because he recognized opportunity. Helping the government offered leverage. Goal. bargaining power for the future. Operation Underworld, as it came to be known, demonstrated something that shocked many officials. Luciano's influence had survived prison intact. With a few conversations, Luciano encouraged cooperation across unions, stevedores, and criminal networks. Sabotage fears subsided. Dock operations stabilized. The government realized what the underworld had known for years. Luciano was valuable even when confined. The paradox of power behind bars. The world believed Luciano had been neutralized. But prison had not ended his influence, it had clarified it. He no longer controlled the streets through presence. He controlled them through legacy, through structure, through the trust of men who still operated by his blueprint. His cooperation during World War II proved that value does not vanish with confinement, it transforms. Luciano had once ruled through proximity and persuasion. Now he ruled through memory and trust. In some ways he was more dangerous in prison, because he no longer had to appear powerful. His influence existed in the architecture of the mafia itself. Even behind bars, Luciano remained what he had always been: a strategist, a builder, and a force whose reach extended far beyond the walls designed to contain him. When Lucky Luciano stepped onto the deck of the ship that would deport him to Italy in 1946, he wasn't merely leaving America. He was leaving the empire he had built brick by brick, alliance by alliance, shadow by shadow. His release from prison, granted in exchange for wartime cooperation, should have felt like liberation. Instead, it felt like displacement. For a man whose power had always been rooted in New York streets, unions, casinos, and nightclubs, Italy was a foreign planet. He had left Sicily as a boy with nothing. He returned as a man with no kingdom. Exile in a land that didn't want him. Italy greeted Luciano not with reverence, but with suspicion. The Italian government, already strained by post-war instability, viewed him as a dangerous American export, a symbol of corruption they wanted no part of. Police monitored him relentlessly. Towns refused to let him stay. To many Sicilian mafiosi, Luciano was no hero. He was an intruder contaminated by American ideas and American ambition. Luciano attempted to plant roots, but every attempt was met with surveillance, raids, and political pressure. The world he had once commanded now treated him as a liability. The irony was painful. In America he had been too invisible. In Italy he was far too visible. Turning toward Havana, a last attempt at power by 1947, it was clear that Italy could not be his base of operations. And so, Luciano looked to Cuba. Cuba was the crossroads of vice and glamour in the post-war years, a place where casinos thrived, politicians welcomed bribes, and Meyer Lansky was weaving the island into a Caribbean extension of their old network. Havana shimmered with the promise of rebirth. For the first time since prison, Luciano felt alive. Gangsters from New York, Chicago, and Florida arrived under the guise of vacations to meet him. They gathered in luxurious suites, sipping rum and plotting expansion. Luciano mediated disputes, offered strategic guidance, and reminded these men, in subtle, elegant ways, why he had once been the mastermind of the American underworld. Cuba was his chance to prove that confinement had not diminished him, that exile had not erased him, that age had not weakened his mind. For a brief moment it worked. He felt like a king again. But the world had changed, and it no longer moved at his command. A world that no longer needed him. Luciano's influence in Havana unsettled the U.S. government. American officials pressured Cuba relentlessly: remove Luciano or lose access to American markets. The decision was swift. He was expelled again, another door shut, another exile imposed. Back in Italy, Luciano watched the criminal world transform from afar. His protégés and rivals reshaped the underworld for a new era. Vito Genovese maneuvered for dominance in New York. Meyer Lansky expanded gambling into Las Vegas with corporate-level sophistication. Frank Costello cultivated political influence deeper than ever. New families in Chicago, Detroit, and Miami emerged with their own networks and visions. Luciano realized, perhaps for the first time, that the system he built, the Commission, the Division of Labor, the National Syndicate, had achieved exactly what he intended: it could function without him. He had once believed influence didn't require proximity. Now he confronted a deeper truth: influence doesn't require permanence. His legacy lived on, but his relevance diminished. A philosopher emerges from the strategist age softened Luciano in ways the streets never had. Without territory to protect or wars to prevent, he turned inward. Visitors to his home in Naples found a man willing to reflect, even to doubt. He spoke openly about the mistakes of his youth, the arrogance of invincibility, and the burden of building something larger than himself. In these conversations, a new Luciano emerged, not the calculating architect of empire, but the philosopher who understood the fragility of influence. He confessed to friends, that power was addictive. That leadership was lonely. That strategy could delay betrayal but never eliminate it. That every empire outgrows its founder. He had once orchestrated the rise of a new underworld. Now he observed its evolution from afar, unable to guide it, unable to shape it. The commission he created still met. The five families still operated. The national syndicate still thrived. But Luciano was a spectator, neither necessary nor feared. The king had become a historian of his own reign. A legacy that refused to fade even as his personal influence waned. Luciano remained a legend. Mobsters across the world still spoke his name with a mixture of respect and awe. Journalists sought him for interviews. Filmmakers approached him for rights to his story. Law enforcement studied him as the blueprint for modern organized crime. It was a strange afterlife, irrelevant to the daily operations of the underworld, yet immortal in the mythology of crime. Luciano understood this paradox. He had built the modern mafia so well that it no longer required a single figure at the top. He dismantled the boss of bosses model, and in doing so ensured that no man, including himself, could ever again rule as absolutely. His genius had made him obsolete. And he accepted it. The endgame of the Shadow King on January 26, 1962, Luciano suffered a fatal heart attack at the Naples airport after meeting with a film producer about a biographical project. The final act was fitting. Luciano, the man who once controlled narratives from the shadows, died while attempting to control the narrative of his own life. He died far from New York's alleys and boardrooms of corruption. Far from the structures he built. Far from the world that once bent around him. Yet in a deeper sense, Luciano never truly left his kingdom. He had redesigned it so thoroughly, so intelligently, that it continued on automatic rhythm long after his voice fell silent. No king rules forever. But the greatest kings leave a kingdom that endures. Luciano's endgame was not a fall. It was a transition, from ruler to relic, from strategist to symbol, from man to myth. He died a king without a kingdom. But the kingdom he built still stands. Lucky Luciano died without power, without territory, and without a seat at the table he once built. Yet in the decades that followed, his influence only grew. His name became shorthand for a new era of organized crime, an era shaped not by brute force, but by structure, intelligence, and interlocking networks. Luciano did not simply rule during his lifetime. He engineered a system that kept ruling long after he was gone. His legacy was not a monument carved from stone. It was a blueprint, one the criminal world adopted, refined, and exported across continents. The Commission, a revolution that became tradition before Luciano, mafia leadership was a rotating cycle of warlords battling for dominance. Boss killed boss. Factions rose and fell. Vendettas smoldered for decades. The criminal world was ruled by ego, not strategy. Luciano shattered that tradition by creating the Commission, a governing council where the bosses of major families met, discussed, voted, and negotiated. It replaced autocracy with cooperation, vendetta with mediation, chaos with stability. This alone would have cemented his place in history. But the true power of the Commission was its endurance. Long after Luciano's exile, the Commission regulated territory disputes. It approved major hits. It stabilized national rackets. It shaped the hierarchy of the five families. The organization he envisioned outlasted wars, betrayals, arrests, and generational turnover. Even when the Commission weakened in the late 20th century due to RICO indictments and federal infiltration, its principles remained the template for how organized crime should govern itself. Luciano had created a parliament for the criminal world, one that made the mafia behave less like a gang and more like a shadow government. Cooperation becomes empire. The national syndicate. Luciano's most profound insight was painfully simple. Crime is more lucrative when criminals cooperate. He broke the tribal mindset that had paralyzed the underworld for generations. He formed alliances with Jewish, Irish, and other ethnic groups, recognizing talent where others saw only bloodlines. He brokered peace across city lines, convinced rivals to share profits, and built a national network of influence that stretched from New York to Chicago, from Florida to California. This national crime syndicate became the first truly interconnected criminal economy in American history. Its operations synchronized like gears in a machine, Narcotics pipelines flowing from Europe and Asia, gambling territories coordinated across cities, labor racketeering influencing union contracts, nationwide casinos in Havana and later Las Vegas feeding profits into multiple families. It was Luciano's grid, his architecture, that allowed organized crime to scale. When people today talk about the mafia as a unified force, they're invoking a concept Luciano invented. Profit sharing, incentive as a weapon. Where old mafia bosses hoarded wealth and ruled through fear, Luciano understood something fundamental. Loyalty is strongest when profitable. His profit-sharing model gave capos and soldiers predictable income. This reduced betrayal, incentivized competence, and allowed operations to grow without constant rebellion. The model spread beyond New York, becoming a standard in criminal organizations from Philadelphia to Kansas City. Even more surprisingly, Luciano's structure influenced groups outside the Italian-American mafia. Irish mobs adopted managerial hierarchies. Jewish syndicates mirrored his discipline. Latin American cartels structured themselves using divisions similar to those Luciano pioneered. Modern cybercrime rings employ decentralized cells reminiscent of his narcotics pipelines. Luciano had discovered a universal truth. Crime behaves like business when business principles are applied. This insight gave birth to a new criminal psychology, one built on efficiency, not impulse. Global echoes. The influence beyond America. As the decades passed, Luciano's blueprint crossed oceans. Sicily, ironically, the land that rejected him, eventually adopted aspects of his vision. Post-war mafia clans embraced collaboration between families, profit distribution, and international trafficking routes. Models Luciano had championed. Latin America cartels in Mexico and Colombia borrowed his division of labor approach, using compartmentalized operations to insulate leadership and maximize profit. Asia and Eastern Europe triads, Yakuza factions, and post-Soviet syndicates evolved increasingly corporate structures that resembled the commission-style oversight boards. Wherever crime matured, Luciano's fingerprints appeared. Myth, memory, and warning. As with all figures who shaped their world, Luciano slipped from history into myth. To gangsters who followed, he became a legend. The mastermind, the visionary, the don who thought bigger than anyone before him. His name was invoked in meetings, in initiation ceremonies, and in prison yards as a symbol of intelligent leadership. To law enforcement, he became the warning, proof that crime, if left unchecked, could evolve into something sophisticated enough to challenge democracy itself. To scholars and historians, he became the case study, the moment when the American underworld transformed from scattered gangs into a cohesive, national enterprise. But for all the mythology that surrounds him, his true legacy is not the violence, nor the glamour, nor even the power he wielded in his prime. His legacy is the system, the structure, the blueprint. A king without a throne, a legacy without end. Luciano died in exile, powerless. But the empire he built, the systems he designed, continued functioning long after his voice fell silent. He understood something few leaders ever grasp. A kingdom built on personality dies with the king. A kingdom built on structure lives forever. He did not seek immortality. He sought efficiency. He did not seek worship. He sought results. He did not build monuments. He built mechanisms. And those mechanisms became the operating manual of organized crime. Lucky Luciano's legacy is not the man himself but the criminal infrastructure he pioneered. An infrastructure that reshaped history, jumped continents, and continues to influence syndicates today. He became myth. He became model. He became warning. And long after his empire lost its king, the blueprint he left behind still quietly governs the underworld. Lucky Luciano's life is not simply the story of a criminal mastermind. It is the story of a cycle, a sweeping arc of ambition, rule, and inevitable consequence. His journey began in the desperation of immigrant slums, rose through the hidden arteries of New York's underworld, and ended in exile on a foreign shore. Across that arc, Luciano proved again and again that power is not seized once. It is cultivated, protected, and ultimately surrendered to forces no man can fully control. Luciano rose because he saw what others did not. While rival gangs choked themselves with vendettas and tradition, he saw opportunity where they saw insult. He saw cooperation where they saw rivalry. He saw the potential for an empire where others saw only chaos. In the turbulence of the early 20th century underworld, he became the architect of order, a strategist who turned violence into policy, rackets into industries, and scattered crews into a national syndicate. His mind didn't simply navigate the criminal world, it rebuilt it. He ruled because he understood people better than they understood themselves. Fear alone could not build loyalty. Respect alone could not guarantee obedience. Luciano blended both into a psychological structure stronger than any gun. Men followed him not only because they feared crossing him, but because they believed he could see 10 steps ahead. Under his leadership, the mafia became something it had never been: stable, scalable, and shockingly efficient. For a brief moment in history, Luciano held a kind of invisible dominion, a power buttressed not by title, but by influence woven into every corner of the underworld. But no man rules the shadows forever. Luciano's reckoning began the moment his system became too visible, too effective, too impossible for the state to ignore. His own brilliance worked against him. The structure he built, the alliances he forged, the influence he exercised, all of it became evidence, or at least the illusion of evidence, for a prosecutor determined to create a symbol of victory. Thomas Dewey didn't need to prove that Luciano physically touched every racket. He only needed to prove that Luciano had built the machine. Omerta, the code that once protected Luciano, betrayed him in the courtroom. Silence was no longer strength, it was suspicion. Influence was no longer mastery, it was motive. Dragged from the shadows into the unforgiving spotlight of public outrage, Luciano stood face to face with the consequence of his rise. His power had insulated him from rivals, but not from a society desperate for moral renewal. He had been the shadow behind the throne, now he was the silhouette on the front page. Yet even after his empire seemed to fall, Luciano adapted. Prison did not break him, it simply shifted his vantage point. Exile did not erase him, it revealed the global ripple of the system he designed. In Italy and Cuba, he discovered an unsettling truth. He had built his empire so well that it no longer needed its architect. The commission met without him. The families thrived without him. The criminal world moved forward as if continuing to follow his blueprint by instinct. To some, this was tragedy. To Luciano, it was validation. His reckoning was not only legal, it was existential. He watched the world evolve beyond him, watched younger men assume the roles he once filled, watched the underworld function on structural momentum rather than personal authority. In old age, stripped of the command he once took for granted, Luciano understood the paradox at the center of his life. He had designed a system that could outlive him, but in doing so he designed one that no longer needed him. This is the final lesson of Luciano's story: every rise demands sacrifice. Every empire demands a reckoning. Every shadow eventually meets the light. Luciano rose through vision, ruled through influence, and fell through the very structure that made him legendary. But he did not die defeated. He died knowing that his ideas had become larger than his life, that the underworld he reshaped would continue long after his name stopped echoing through the streets of New York. In the end, Lucky Luciano remains not just a figure of crime, but a figure of consequence. A reminder that power built in the shadows still casts a long and lasting shadow of its own. His life was rise, rule, reckoning. And his legacy endures in all three.